throughout the century. I want to know what this abuse does to a young black player. So I've come to Tottenham Hotspur's home ground to speak to a player who's experienced racist abuse and a sports journalist who's reported on racism in the game. How did the abuse, the bigotry, how did it manifest itself for you as a player?
Well, I always remember when you initially walk out and you run onto the field and the booing, the monkey chanting. But obviously in the 80s in this country there was also the banana throwing. I remember one particular game, it sort of ran out of play and I sort of chased it, and then all the supporters were sort of leaning as if they were going to jump out at you. And I thought, whew, I took that in the sort of late 70s moving on. You know, imagine Walter Tull, you know, in 1900 to have actually played in that environment, and he'd done that with a distinction and I think a humility. He never really was in receipt of the fullest appreciation of what he'd done and what he's achieved.
But it's great that we're talking about him now, because
exactly.
we can see in a typical Premiership game, Tottenham Arsenal, Tottenham Chelsea, with the representation of black players in those sorts of games, that you've got to trail it back to Walter Tull.
Yes, it's a wonderful, poignant story, and I think one that I feel that it's had a very, very lasting impression on me.
Like many players since, Walter didn't react to the racist abuse. According to the eyewitness report, he seemed to rise above it.
Let me tell these Bristol hooligans that Tull is so clean in mind and method as to be a model for all white men who play football. Tull was the best forward on the field.
Walter clearly had great composure, courage and resolve. He needed it on the pitch, and in later life, he would need it on the battlefield. And from the very beginning, Walter had to be brave. I've come to Folkestone on the south coast of England. It was here, in this small Victorian seaside town, that Walter was born. And from the very beginning, Walter didn't have to look far for an inspirational role model. It appears courage and determination ran in the family. His father, Daniel Tull, who was the son of a slave, always stood up for what he believed was right.
He was quite a feisty character, I think, Daniel, because he left Barbados because he was badly treated by the man he was apprenticed to as a joiner, and he went round the guy's house and demanded his wages, and I think they exchanged blows. But anyway, for whatever reason, he left Barbados. In about 1876, he came to Britain. He worked on a ship, I think, as a carpenter, and ended up in Folkestone.
Just like my own father, Walter's dad came to Britain in search of a better life. And though it's rarely mentioned in the history books, there was a small but visible black British presence.
Daniel arrived at the end of the 19th century. It's difficult to say exactly how many black people were around, but we're talking about tens of thousands of people. And at that time, there were significant populations of black people, particularly in the port cities like London, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow. People would have been aware of a black presence. In Folkestone, it would not have been such a common sight.
Daniel settled in Folkestone, and at the local Methodist church, he met, then married Alice Palmer, a local white girl. The records don't show how a mixed-race couple were received in a small Victorian town, but Daniel earned a regular wage as a skilled carpenter, and the Tulls started a family. Walter was born in April 1888, the couple's fifth child. With his brothers and sisters, he grew up in a close-knit, loving family in this small house in a working-class suburb of Folkestone. And at the local school, he learned how to read and write, and, of course, about the glories of the British Empire. But the poor lad was about to be hit by a succession of tragedies that even Charles Dickens would have struggled to dream up. When Walter was just 6 years old, his mother died of breast cancer. His father remarried, But 3 years later, Daniel Tull died of heart disease. There was no money to feed the remaining family. The Tull children were devastated and destitute. And the horrors of the workhouse loomed.
They were prisons of the poor. They were horrendous institutions. They were the spectre that haunted every working class family, that kept working class people in place. You know, people would do anything and everything to keep out of the workhouse.
But fortunately, God saved the Tull boys from the workhouse. Well, not God exactly, but the Methodist Church. Walter and his older brother were sent away from their family home to a Methodist children's orphanage in the grimy East End of London. It's hard to imagine the fear that these young boys must have felt arriving in the world's biggest city in 1898. There were 330 orphan children packed within the walls of the children's home at Bonner Road, most of whom were tough city street kids. And Walter's brother wrote about their unhappy introduction to life at the home.
A bell rings. It is 6:20 a.m. All the boys in their room rise and dress, after which they make their beds. Being newcomers, we start at the bottom, and naturally the bottom is cleaning of boots, or rather shoes. Not one pair, but all the pairs of the household, the sisters especially. Having finished 15 pairs of shoes, an inspection by the sister is enacted and, if favourable, put away in various lockers. Breakfast came as a happy relief.
Life was clearly hard for the Tull boys, and I met Laura Peters, who has researched Victorian orphanages to try to understand their experience.
So Walter and his brother Edward arrive in London. Their parents have recently passed away. What sort of experience might they have gone through?
I think they would have been very homesick. I think they would have missed the rest of their siblings. They were from a large family. And I think they would probably find that the discipline was quite strict. I think it would have been a real shock to Edward and Walter.
What were the social connotations of the label orphan?
In the 19th century, if you were an orphan, you were bereft of happiness, of hope, of joy. So it was a condition not only of being without parents, but being quite miserable, and disadvantaged and vulnerable. Being of mixed race would have meant that they were fairly marginalised within society.
It was a tough childhood, but Walter stood up for himself and settled quickly. In fact, it was his older brother who found life more difficult.
I was homesick and a little frightened. Walter, being of a sturdier mould, seemed ready to sample new ways and new means.
I'm beginning to get a sense of how difficult life was for these two kids, and how Walter in particular had to develop a thick skin just to survive. Every day, there were prayers, lessons, and work. A disciplined approach that sought to improve the children.
These two little boys, they arrived at Bonner Road into an uncertain world, an uncertain environment. They'd lost both their parents. It must have been a huge turning point for both lads.
For nearly 3 years, the brothers were inseparable. But then, life dealt Walter another cruel blow.
Both Tull boys had fine voices and sang in the orphanage choir. In 1900, they sang at St. John's Methodist Church in Glasgow.
The touring orphanage choir charmed the audience, and Edward Tull was spotted by a middle-class couple who then asked to adopt the boy. On the 8th of November 1900, Walter's brother left the orphanage and took the train to begin a new life with his new family in Glasgow. Walter was now completely alone.
It's obvious he was very, very upset because his schoolwork suffered. There were reports of his behaviour getting worse. The years between 1900 and about 1903 were very difficult years for Walter. You know, it had been one tragedy after the other. It was a very, very difficult time.
But Walter came out fighting. Somehow he found the will to survive such a traumatic childhood. And through the orphanage football team, he found a means of escape. At the age of 20, his determination and talent saw him star for amateur team Clapton Orient. And when I look at him in the Clapton team photo, I see a young man who has somehow found an inner strength. When he joined Spurs, he could have had no way of knowing how much that inner strength would be tested. The racist abuse Walter suffered at Bristol City signalled the end of his Spurs career. He played only 7 times for the club in the 1909 season and found himself isolated from the first team and confined to the reserves. It seemed as if Spurs weren't prepared to stand up for their player, and Walter became the forgotten man.
There were certain people within the Spurs management and directors that just thought it's too much hassle. We don't need it. Walter might be a good player, but he's not good for team spirit or morale because we become the subject of abuse and we can do without it. And Walter became a victim twice over, a victim of the abuse and then of the consequences of that abuse.
In 1911, Walter left Spurs and London behind and joined Northampton Town. His career had been held back for 2 frustrating seasons, but here in this small industrial town, he had the chance for a new start.
This is where Walter lived when he was playing for Northampton. Now, Northampton was nothing like cosmopolitan London, nor was it a port town. In 1911, this was the kind of place where they'd never even seen a black person before. But Walter was black, playing football, scoring goals, and thriving.
It seemed after years of turmoil, Walter had finally found a home. But as Northampton moved up the league, the German army moved across Europe.
Association football was no longer celebrated as the great British spectator sport. With war fast approaching, it was now seen as a dangerous distraction.
When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, there was no conscription. The War Office needed volunteers and asked every brave British man to stand up and fight for their country. Walter answered the call. On the 21st of December 1914, Walter left his home in Northampton, travelled the 60 miles south to London and presented himself at the recruitment office. He was ready to fight for his country, but his country wasn't so sure.
A taste of the Army's attitude to African people can be found in the 1914 edition of the Manual of Military Law. Under a heading which reads Coloured Troops, it states, "Troops formed of coloured individuals belonging to savage tribes and barbarous races should not be employed in a war between civilised states."
They didn't want men of colour to join, full stop. The usual ploy used by the recruitment people was, there's a black guy that's just walked in, well, tell him to read the eye test from this end of the room, he'll never see it, or kind of, fail him somewhere, use a bureaucratic procedure to fail him. Now, they couldn't do it with Walter. When Walter turned up, he was a known man. This was a guy that played for Spurs, played for Northampton, was on cigarette cards in newspapers. He was a bit of a face, that walked through the door. So it's difficult to fail him on the medical because he's a fit footballer.
Walter became the 55th member of the newly formed and utterly unique 1st Football Battalion. The battalion was a result of the FA and the War Office joining forces to tap into the game's popularity. and this archive gives a rare glimpse of the football stars of the